Number 5. The Knife Blade Man. Discovered in 2018 in northern Italy, a group of archaeologists were digging up a massive gravesite of the Lombardo, an ancient Germanic people. Found in a necropolis, which is a very fancy word for a large, elaborate tomb, and maybe one of the best words in the English language, the team found hundreds of skeletons that were at the site, including horses and greyhounds, and for the most part, they're not particularly notable. You've seen one old bag of bones, you've seen them all, except for one skeleton that in the place of a forearm was an impressive blade. Now this raises countless fascinating questions. Who was this guy? Was this the first Assassin's Creed protagonist? Some legendary madman of a warrior who lost an arm and thought, I don't know, put a blade on there, I can still fight? Well, the Lombardo people placed a great emphasis on war and combat in their culture, so it is possible. The researchers noted that there was a clear dated buckle around his arm, and pressure on the bones of his arm showed that it was an intentional prosthetic, right down to the wear and tear on his teeth, suggesting he tightened the straps for his hidden blade with his teeth. Most of the other skeletons found in the necropolis all had blades buried with them at their sides, perhaps ritually out of honor, but this unique specimen had it grafted onto his arm like he's history's first cyborg or Baraka from Mortal Kombat. To be able to not only survive an amputation, pre-antibiotics and modern medicine is already impressive. And hey, if you're always looking to learn something from knife arm skeletons, then toss a subscribe our way. Top 5 Scaries always got a couple scary videos for you every day. Let's creep on creeping on.
Swinging in at number 4, the Persian Siege. Now in the ancient world, sieges and bloody battles were the only real way to get things done, but during an age where the most cutting edge technology was a composite ballista, it was pretty shocking when archaeologists discovered some startling evidence of chemical warfare. In 256 AD, well, turns out that over 2,000 years ago, 19 Roman soldiers rushed into a cramped underground tunnel as they prepared to defend the Roman-held Syrian city of Dura-Europos from an army of Persian soldiers digging beneath the city's mud brick walls. Instead of meeting a horde of Persian besiegers though, they were met by one soldier, and then a wall of noxious black smoke turned their lungs into acid. They all died in excruciating pain, sealed for eternity beneath the earth. But flash forward to the 1920s though, and French archaeologist Robert Dumensil began excavating the Roman site that backed up against the Euphrates River. That's when he found the piled up skeletal remains of the 19 Roman soldiers and one lone Persian at the other end of the tunnel. Initially he thought that the Persian soldier had somehow managed to defeat 19 highly trained legionnaires in close quarters combat, but that's when he noticed crystals of sulfur and bitumen scattered across the tunnel walls. Turned out the Persian force had developed an experimental tar-like petrochemical that burnt fast and hot and killed with deadly efficiency. Also turns out that chemical warfare was much more common than we expected in the ancient world. What a way to go, eh?
Number 3. The Black Sarcophagus. Now you might have heard of this one before. If you were on Twitter much a couple years ago, maybe you remember vaguely hearing about sarcophagus juice. Maybe those words are ringing a strange bell. There was a pretty good petition going around to let people drink the sarcophagus juice. But let's back up a bit. What is sarcophagus juice and where did it come from and why do we want to drink it? Well, I've got the answers. Somewhat. I've got some answers. In 2018, a team of archaeologists digging in Alexandria, Egypt, discovered a massive granite black sarcophagus, which immediately set off everybody's warning signs that you should not touch that. People wondered what the 30-ton stone slab could be containing, with some even suggesting it could have been the mighty body of Alexander the Great. People warned the archaeologists that there, could be some ancient evil, like when King Tut's tomb was raided and a very strange curse befell the explorers and excavators. Well, what they found wasn't a hidden curse, but honestly something stranger. 3 skeletons inside the coffin with a skull shattered by an arrow and a whole lot of mysterious black goop, or sarcophagus juice. So again, looping right back around it. What is the sarcophagus juice and does it taste good? Well, scientists analyzed the sludge and discovered that it was made from a combination of animal fats, tree resin, beeswax, and crude oil. The sludge has been recovered out of multiple coffins and sarcophagi, so it's not exclusive to this dreaded one. But that doesn't explain why this nasty stuff is there. Well, there's some theories about this, no concrete answers, but I'll do my best. It's said that when someone died, they become a form of the god Osiris, who is associated with death and rebirth. Osiris was called the Black One, and is depicted with very dark black skin in the guise of a mummified body. As well, black is also a color associated with the deposits on the bank of the River Nile after a flood season. Fresh and fertile soil was seen as inherently regenerative. So it's theorized that with the linking concepts of Osiris and the regeneration of the soil, soaking and filling the coffins with this black sludge was a very confusing part of the mummification process. Number 2. Headless Vikings. In 2008, a group of archaeologists archaeologists were doing some fairly routine work in Dorset, a seaside town in England, in a rather dull job to improve local roads around the area. As could be expected, not too much of note was discovered, except for the mass grave of 54 Headless Viking mercenaries. And not just were their skulls missing, but the rib cages, arms, and leg bones were all arranged neatly, surrounded by discarded teeth. No clothes or weaponry was discovered. So what happened? Because nothing my imagination is coming up with is conjuring anything good. Well, the bones revealed some fascinating finds, and I'll warn you now, by Odin's beard, they're all terrifying options. The teeth surrounding the grave were all filed down, but done neatly as if a craftsman had done it. Obviously, pre-Novocaine dental surgery wouldn't go down easy, so the process must have been excruciating, suggesting perhaps these men had it done to them out of some sort of punishment, or they did it to themselves to frighten their opponents and show them just how strong they were. Neither one of those options is particularly pleasant to consider. But now let's get spine chillin' with it. The archaeologists' prevailing theory about what happened to this big Nordic pile of bones is that looking at the wound patterns on the ribs and the torso bones were smart, surgical, precise blows, not matching with a rabid hack job you'd expect from a brawl. The archaeologists suggested that the Vikings weren't slain in battle, but rather offered up perhaps to some sort of strange, sadistic ritual, or perhaps a mass execution. It would explain why the men had no gear with them as well. The large number of bodies and intense cruelty of it suggests that there wasn't any trained executioners, leading to the prevailing theory that it's a dark, dark ritual. Number 1. Bog People. Name one good thing that's ever been found in a bog. Need some help? There's never been one. For peat farmers in northern Europe, it's a thankless life, working in wet, muddy bogs and occasionally finding leathery preserved bog mummies. Due to the low temperatures, lack of oxygen, and high acidity of bogs, bodies found there are preserved disturbingly well. Well, preserved is a bit of a misnomer. They're twisted and rived, but they're intact, sort of. It's hard to think of these as preserved well because they look like the scariest things you've ever seen, but the process is weirdly fascinating if you're interested in looking up something disgusting. This happens all over northwestern Europe, with no one specific case to point to. It happens all over Ireland, Germany, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and so on. The bodies range from anywhere as old as 8,000 years old, preserved, to the most recent appearing to have been from the early turn of our century. Now, no one really has any idea how many of these bog bodies could be out there, and no one really knows how the unfortunate bog victims ended up in their final muddy resting spot. Some of them could possibly have just been unlucky souls who found themselves lost and fell in. But another prevailing theory is that Roman Iron Age people in northern Europe sacrificed people to the bogs, which sounds too dark to be real, but apparently is. They would also offer people as sacrifice or as punishment for their perceived social imperfections, which, may I just say, I am very glad this practice isn't commonplace, because I would be cast into the bogs faster than you could say peat deposit.
Kicking off at number 5, The Pit of Arms, which is a pretty intriguing title, isn't it? If not probably the best opening track to a death metal album. But as it turns out, this particular Pit of Arms is much more terrifying than the likes of Cradle of Filth or Job for a Cowboy, because it's exactly what it says on the tin, or the pit to be specific. Throughout the archaeological dig sites of ancient Europe, researchers have found numerous circular pits constructed in the same strange fashion, dotted across the continent, that all seem to date back to around, roughly speaking, 4000 BC. Most of them have left researchers pretty perplexed, but this one in particular, a pit found near the village of Bergheim in France that was filled to the brim with 6 adult arms, 1 child's arm, and random scattered hand bones. Also, the team of researchers on this mystery obviously had a sense of humour, as they named their research paper A Farewell to Arms. So what were they doing there? Well, strangely enough, above the layer of arms and hand bones were the skeletons of the limbless victims, which seems to suggest these Neolithic victims were tortured and dismembered before they were later buried on top. It's left researchers pretty perplexed, to say the least, but it seems to indicate evidence of organised warfare in the Neolithic period of ancient Europe, although no other evidence of conflict has been found to support this theory. And people have been digging in Europe for a long time. They could have been captured enemy warriors, or they could have been innocent victims of a massacre. The only thing we can know for certain is their arms were thrown in a pit, and then they shortly followed. That's grim.
Number 4. The Hanging Coffins. We're going up to China for our next one, specifically Hubei, China. There's a cave there that the locals call the Cave of the Fairies, and you've probably already realized that there's gonna be a dark secret involved with the Cave of Fairies. We never talk about anything nice here. It was said that the mythical creatures were supposed to live in the cave, but those who explored it inside found that there wasn't much of anything living at all, instead finding something deeply disturbing. Rows and rows of coffins, some hanging from ropes, some jammed, wedged between the rocks of the cave. The coffins themselves were massive, weighing around 200 pounds each, and some destroyed and ravaged. Dating the coffins puts them at around 1200 years old, and are thought to have been put up by the ancient Bog People, an extinct culture hailing from China, famous for this unique practice of hanging coffins from caves. It's thought that this served two purposes: one, as a ritualistic offering meant to bless the dead, and two, from a practical, pragmatic sense, it would prevent any would-be carrion eaters from picking through to get a meal. Fascinatingly, it can be seen that all of the coffins were carved from a single tree, one big log. One wonders if that was part of the ritual element of it. Now, the coffins being smashed is interesting, because the discoverers of the coffins theorized that the damage was actually pretty recent, dating it to the 1960s. And their prevailing theory was that someone wandered into this cave in a place of desperation and smashed the coffins to garner some firewood in the hopes that they could survive the night and not pass among the hanging dead. Let's just hope they didn't release any ancient curses at the same time.
Coming in next at number 3, the Altamura Man. Now, dying alone is a terrifying enough notion, but how about dying alone at the bottom of a 26-foot deep well in the far recesses of a further 200-foot long tunnel system, only to be encrusted into a wall of pure limestone for over 150,000 years? Well, whilst you'd be perfectly preserved and your skeleton frozen in time for modern scientists to find you, that's also exactly what happened to one of our unfortunate Neanderthal ancestors, the Altamura Man. And his skeleton was so well preserved that researchers could even recreate perfectly how he would have looked way back when. And he looked like this. What a great looking fella. Hasn't he got the kindest eyes you've ever seen? Well, unfortunately, way back in 1993, when he was discovered by spelunkers in a karstic cave near the Italian town of Altamura, he was a little bit less kindly looking and instead resembled something straight out of a nightmare, petrified by stalagmites and sunken into the cave wall itself through thousands upon thousands of years of limestone droplets. I'm not sure what's more terrifying, the ultimate fate of the Altamura Man or the fact that he was discovered when he was lost to the mysteries of the earth for over 150,000 years by a bunch of spelunkers. Next up at number 2, Capacocha. Very little is known about the ancient ritualistic practice of Capacocha, and the earliest known written accounts were from the Spanish conquistadors in their observations of ancient Inca practices, documenting numerous accounts of child sacrifices where children would be led to caves high up in the mountainous peaks of the Andes region to give their lives and be reborn as gods and goddesses in their culture. It sounds like incredibly heavy stuff, and it is, but the practice of Capacocha was incredibly important to the Inca civilization, and it was considered to be the highest honor for members of their society. And although that's terrifying enough in itself, the method in which they were sacrificed is even more terrifying. Essentially, they were paraded around the kingdom with huge feasts held in their honor, where the procession led by the emperor would make its way toward the frozen peaks of the mountain over month-long ritualistic celebrations. There, the sacrifice was taken to a tomb and offered up to the gods, where the tomb was sealed over days with mounds and mounds of dirt. So then, when a group of archaeologists were surveying the region in 1999 at a site found near a volcano in Argentina, they unwittingly unearthed one of these tombs of legend, only to find a scene literally frozen in time. 3 ancient Inca children perfectly preserved in ceremonious fashion down to the ice-cold climate of the region. Whew, yeah, exactly. That's ancient history for you guys. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Sacred Ridge. Now, if you know anything about Sacred Ridge, an ancient site in Durango, Colorado, you'll know that it's synonymous with one of the most grisly and violent atrocities in ancient American history. What was once thought to be evidence of a peaceful habitat of the early Pueblo culture, after closer excavation, it was revealed that Sacred Ridge played witness to a bloody and brutal massacre, given the fact that 2 of the excavated pit houses contain nearly 15,000 human body fragments belonging to around 35 separate people, thought to be about half of the village's population. After analysis of the bone fragments, evidence of extreme torture and mutilation quickly became apparent, and it is thought that the massacre was part of a wider uprising in the ridge's basin area sometime around the year 810. Now, the reason for this massacre will never be truly known, but the grisly reality of this discovery can only lead historians to study the archaeological evidence, which all points toward methods of extreme torture. After studying the bone fragments of the 33 victims' feet, researchers concluded that these methods of torture all bore the hallmarks of hobbling. Yes, hobbling, as in the excruciating action carried out by Annie Wilkes in Stephen King's Misery. It was thought that hobbling was used as a violent warning sign to other victims, but the fact that pretty much all of the bone fragments contain the same trauma marks only leads to more questions. Now, there are a multitude of theories surrounding the fate of the victims of Sacred Ridge, but it seems that the answer, whatever it may be, will be forever lost to the mysteries of time. Kicking off at number 5, the Phaleron Delta Necropolis. Now, Greece, of course, is the land of one of this planet's longest standing ancient civilizations, and dig sites are a dime a dozen across both the rural and metropolitan areas of the country, slowly uncovering the mysteries of a long lost Greek society. While in early 2016, researchers discovered one terrifyingly unique manner of burial and mass execution. Apparently because, well, they're not entirely sure. Found in a large ancient cemetery in part of the Phaleron Delta Necropolis in Athens were at least 80 skeletons in a line stacked on top of each other with their wrists clamped together in a chain of iron shackles. The strangest thing was, though, that all of these men were incredibly young and in a very good state of health, indicating that they weren't slaves or common criminals, and the orderly, uniform way that they were buried seemed to support this. Whatever happened was an incredibly violent act, with their hands bound above their heads before being uniformly executed. The whole thing doesn't really make any sense at all, but the leading theory is that all of these young men were part of an attempted coup during a period of great unrest for Athenian society. The coup failed, of course, but the fact that these men were all buried in a respectful manner despite the violent circumstances that they were executed in leaves far more perplexing questions than it does answers. Coming in at number 4, Hearts of Lead. And yeah, pretty death metal too, right? I could release an album at this rate. In actual fact though, this entry on our list is possibly the most modern that we've ever covered, and yet it still dates back to over 400 years ago. Now, have you ever loved someone so much that you want to be buried with their heart in a lead urn for 400 years? And also, I'm quite concerned as to whether these hearts were given posthumously. I really hope they were. Well, as it seems, archaeologists from France's National Institute were extensively excavating graves for years at an ancient cemetery in northwestern France at the convent of the Jacobins in Rouen, in one of the oldest preserved cemeteries in Europe. There, underneath the basement of the convent, they unearthed hundreds of burials, some of which dated back to the late 16th century, and 5 of which, strangely enough, were buried with the same familiar set of artifacts, a heart-shaped urn made of lead. Ah. That's cute, right? Well, after taking a closer look at these warm fuzzy relics, it was discovered that they each had a human heart sealed within them. After more digging, it became apparent that it was all the rage for wealthy upper-class families to be buried with the literal hearts of their spouses and loved ones, and they were also so well preserved that scientists could scan the organs through MRI imaging to figure out what they died from. Nothing says I love you quite like, here's my heart in an urn, right? Next up at number 3, the mystery of Herxheim. And this one is pretty damn terrifying, really. Sometime in 5300 BC, which is a long time ago, what is known as a linear pottery culture developed in the southwest region of Herxheim in Germany, one that for all intents and purposes could be described as an idyllic, peaceful Stone Age settlement. Safe from invaders and predators, the village thrived with its rudimentary agriculture and societal development. That is until sometime around 4950 BC, when the settlement in Herxheim abruptly and without warning disappeared. But they didn't exactly disappear. Instead, they were ritualistically butchered, smashed to pieces, and buried beneath the same dirt that they once called home. Turns out in 2009, an archaeological dig site unearthed human remains of over 1,000 ancient villagers. The bones were of men, women, children, even infants and fetuses. Stranger still though, tool markings on all of the bones showed that the flesh had been carefully scraped off, while larger bones had been broken, possibly to get at the marrow inside. Hell, even the skulls were cracked open in an effort to extract their brains. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and were incredibly proficient at butchering the human anatomy, presumably to eat, as there was no sign of the removed flesh in the surrounding area. It gets weirder though, because after extracting DNA from their remains, it turned out that these people came from all over Europe in roughly a 500-mile radius. In fact, the leading theory is that all of these people volunteered to come to Herxheim on their own free will to be ritualistically sacrificed processed and then seemingly eaten. Yeah. Coming in at number 2, the Tomb of the Sunken Skulls. Talking of ritualistic burial sites, there's an even older one, and it's even weirder, actually. Sometime in 2009, archaeologists found what they believe to be a Stone Age settlement near what was once a shallow lake in Motala, a town in southwest Sweden. The routine dig took a strange turn though when researchers discovered the skulls and skull fragments from 11 individuals, including men, women, children and infants. In fact, the site, which would later be known as Canal Jordan, turned out to be nearly 8,000 years old. But we also have to remember that Canal Jordan was a lake, and the remains were found stacked inside a large stone mass grave with a giant heavy lid built on the bottom of a body of water. Hey, it gets weirder though, guys, because 2 of the human skulls found were pierced with wooden stakes, with the majority of the others showing signs of also being penetrated by sharp objects. It seemed to point toward using their heads as some sort of bizarre trophy or totem, but also it poses the question, why would you then bury them underneath a lake in a stone tomb with children? But hey, again, it gets even weirder because one of the female skulls found there was actually filled with fragments of bone from all of the other skulls in the tomb, like some weird kind of horrifying potpourri. The leading theory is that Canal Jordan likely served as a sacred meeting spot for several nomadic bands of Mesolithic Swedes roaming the forest and shores of Sweden over 8,000 years ago. For some reason though, they felt compelled to bury people's heads in a stone tomb at the bottom of a lake, and no one really knows why. My best guess though, vampires. Or aliens. Alien vampires. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the Clad Holland mummies. If you know anything about bog bodies, you'll know that they're already terrifying enough. The British Isles are relatively unique in the sense that they're littered with geographical peat bogs, a unique high acid, low oxygen environment which inhibits specific bacteria that break down organics. Because of that, they're also perfect for preserving bodies, and history has shown numerous instances of discovering ancient bodies hidden away in the deep peat bogs of Scotland, Ireland, England and Wales. Well, usually they're just incredibly well preserved, mummified perfectly for archaeological purposes, but back in early 2012, scientists discovered 2 3,000-year-old Scottish bog bodies, remnants of the 11th century ancestral houses of Clad Holland, a prehistoric village on the Isle of South Uist. But hold on, because if that timeline isn't already peculiar enough, it gets weirder. Because first and foremost, researchers discovered that these 2 corpses had been buried between 300 and 600 years after their death. Hold on though, because it does get weirder, because these corpses quickly had scientists scratching their heads because their bones just didn't match up, although they showed clear signs of being articulated as one whole cadaver. Turned out after DNA testing each of their limbs, they were from completely separate people, all of which had died at different points in ancient history. It's what's called a composite mummy, and no one has any idea what the hell it was or still is, but for some reason an ancient society was collecting body parts and sticking them all together in some horrifying Frankensteinian manner. Yeah, let that one sink in, just like a peat bog body.